Good morning. We are very pleased to have been invited to be part of this exciting and socially relevant session. And obviously, we are really sorry not to be able to participate in person. I am Thomas Lehečka, and the following work is a joint paper by me and Jan-Ola Östman entitled "What Everyone Should Know About Language, a Survey Among the Global Linguistics Community." What we are presenting today constitutes a core part of a larger project where I'm the PI, named Consequential Misconceptions About Local and Global Linguistic Realities. And we use the word consequential here in the sense of misconceptions that actually have real-life consequences. The project was inspired by recent efforts in several other scientific fields to examine lay people's perceptions and understanding of scientific facts and phenomena. I just want to mention Hans Rosling's work here as a pretty prominent example of such studies, which have shown that the general public has quite often a somewhat skewed perception of reality, to put it mildly. And maybe most importantly, there are many misperceptions among the public that concern some of the most pressing issues that we are facing as a society, like social inequality and climate change, and that these misperceptions make it very difficult to tackle and to solve these issues efficiently on an individual, societal, and even global level. So there is a need to educate people about the basic realities or the basic facts about the world so that we can guide our efforts to solve the issues in the most appropriate way. Now, in our opinion, because of the absolutely vital role language plays in the lives of individuals and in cultures and societies, it is as important that the general public has a factual understanding of language as it is that they understand the basics of, say, maths or climate science. So in the main part of the project, we carry out a survey about what the general public knows and does not know about important language-related issues, what the most common misconceptions about language are among the public, and what the actual prevalence of those misconceptions is. Afterwards, based on the results of the survey, we will be creating educational content for upper secondary schools to address these common misconceptions. But first, before carrying out the survey to the general public, and in order to do it in a meaningful way, we need to decide what questions we should use in the survey. So in other words, we have to decide what questions the knowledge of the general public should be tested with. And in order to do that, we have to determine what the most important facts about language are that the public should be aware of and that have consequences for their well-being. Or to put it shortly, what everyone should know about language. And this is the topic of our presentation today. Now, given that there is no single objective way to assess the importance of individual facts about language, we chose to approach this issue in a sort of democratic way, I guess you could call it. So we decided to ask as many linguists as possible around the world, and we were curious about the consensus among linguists regarding what everyone should know about language, and whether there is, in fact, a clear consensus about this. So we carried out an online survey to linguists that some of you might be familiar with, and maybe some of you even participated in. We sent out survey invitations to the linguistics departments of all the top 300 universities on the QS World University Ranking for Linguistics in 2020, as well as via Linguist List and the newsletters of a number of other linguistic organizations. In the survey, we asked linguists to write down up to 8 questions about language that they think everyone should know the answer to. And we asked them to write their responses, meaning their chosen questions, in the open text input fields that you see here. In addition to asking them for these open-ended text responses in the form of questions, we also asked the respondents to rate the importance of 15 pre-given questions about language that we ourselves had formulated. And the responses gave their ratings on a 3-point scale from not so important to very important. In this way, we were also able to do some more elaborate quantitative analyses of the responses using ordinal regression models to examine whether the ratings differ between linguists that represent different demographic groups. So, in total, we received responses from 538 linguists who are affiliated with 247 different universities around the world. Each dot on this map indicates a university or institute that is represented among the affiliations of the linguists in our sample. So we can safely say that we have a pretty varied geographical distribution here. The 538 linguists wrote in total 3,349 suggestions for questions that they think everyone should know about language, meaning that we received, on average, 6 questions from each of the respondents. Now, in order to make sense of over 3,300 open-ended responses and to identify meaningful patterns among them, we needed to do a fair amount of data coding. Specifically, we tagged the responses at several different levels. So first, we tagged each response with keywords, similar to the ones you use when you submit a paper to a journal. So for example, one of the responses we got was, how do languages change with time? And we tagged this response with the keywords language change and variation. Another response we received was, why are languages constantly changing? Which, in our view, is very similar to the previous response. So we tagged it with the same keywords, language change and variation, and so on. In total, we used some 130 different keywords to tag all the questions. After tagging all the individual responses, we grouped them so that responses with an identical set of keywords, that is, responses that were similar in meaning, were always put in the same group. Then we tagged each such group with what we call here a macro question. That is an overarching question that functions as an identifier and that covers all the different formulations of the individual questions in the group. For example, in the current case, the 2 responses here would represent the macro question, how and why do languages change? Okay, so let us now get over to the results. I'll start by talking about macro questions, since these are probably most easily digestible, even when you haven't had the chance to familiarize yourself with the coding scheme that we've used. I'll just hide myself from the view here so you can see the full table. So remember, these represent groups of individual responses that may differ in how exactly they were formulated, but they had more or less the same content. So these are the 10 most frequent macro questions in our data. Number 1 is, how and why do languages change, with 61 responses. Number 2 is, how do children acquire language, with 58 responses. Then we have, how many languages are there in the world, at number 3. What are the benefits of learning foreign languages? And then the very sort of general question, what is language? And I'll just quickly read through the rest of these as well. And I'm sorry that we don't have the time to let you sort of digest these for a bit longer. But while you're looking at these results, you can try to think about whether you find any of these questions surprisingly popular, or maybe the opposite, whether you feel that there are some questions missing from this list that you think should be there. So what are the functions of language? What is the difference between spoken and written language? Does language influence thought? What is the difference between a language and a dialect? What differentiates human language from animal communication? And just a quick look at the next 10 questions on the list. What is linguistics? Are some languages better than others? Are sign languages real languages? How common is multilingualism in the world? What are the different parts of speech? What are the basic components of language? What is the relation between language and culture? What other languages are related to your first language? What does it mean to know a language? And what is the difference between learning your first language and learning all subsequent languages? So, is there anything that is surprising about the questions on this list? I just want to say maybe one more thing at this point. If you look at the number of responses per macro question, these questions have been mentioned by around 20 to 30 respondents. So each question by about 5% of the total number of respondents. And even with respect to the macro questions in the top 10 that we looked at on the previous slide, none of these has more than 61 occurrences in the data, which is only about 11% of the respondents. So all of this suggests that there is quite a lot of variation among linguists regarding what they think everyone should know about language. And it is definitely not the case that all linguists immediately think of the same questions as being important. Now, let's also have a brief look at the most frequent keywords in the data. Here is the top 20 list of the keywords that we used for tagging the individual responses. Here it's language learning that is on the top, with 331 of the more than 3,000 responses being about language learning. So notice that while the most frequent macro question was how and why do languages change, the most frequent topic that the individual questions cover or mention is not language change, which is number 8 here on the list of keywords, but language learning instead. Questions that concern language structure in some form or another are almost equally popular, as are questions about how different languages compare to each other, either with respect to their structure or how quote unquote good or expressive they are. Many of the individual questions also dealt with the global perspective on linguistic realities. For example, how many languages are there in the world, and what are the most spoken languages in the world, and so on. Linguistic concept refers to questions asking about definitions of concepts, like what is a noun, or what is multilingualism. Language as a medium refers to language with a capital L, so to speak. So language is a system of human communication, whereas specific language refers to questions about some specific language like English or Japanese. Then comes language change, variation, number of languages, multilingualism, linguistic diversity, correctness, pragmatics, and so on. Lastly, I'd like to say a few words about the second part of our survey, where we asked the respondents to rate 15 pre-given questions about language with respect to their importance, or with respect to how important it would be that the general public knows the answer to them. And I think it's really important to mention these results too, because they really do reveal something interesting about the responses overall. So we asked the respondents to rate these questions because we were wondering whether there is universal agreement among the global linguist community about what is and what is not so important for the purposes of the general public. So this table includes our 15 questions, ordered according to the average rating from most important to least important. This table is from a paper that we've recently submitted. And well, first of all, I can tell you that there are significant differences between the ratings of several of the questions, depending on the respondents' demographic characteristics. So what part of the world the respondents come from, what linguistic subfields they are active in, and even their gender. But more importantly, for the purposes of this talk, it's worthwhile just to have a look at the order of the questions here. The question that on average was rated as the most important of the 15 questions here was, how can social status and power be expressed through language? Now, why did I say that this is an interesting or revealing result? Well, if you remember the top 20 lists of macro questions and keywords that I showed you earlier, you will remember that there were no questions about power or social status among them. So here on the list of the most frequent macro questions, there is no mention of language and power. In fact, we would have to go all the way down to place 44 on the list to find the macro question, what is the relationship between language and power, which was mentioned spontaneously by just 12 of the respondents. On the other hand, the macro question, how many languages are there in the world, was the third most frequent among the open responses, but the same question is in the middle of the pack with regard to the average ratings of the 15 pre-given questions that we presented to the respondents, way below the question about language and power. So what's going on here? And actually, we hope that you might be able to help us with explaining this or with suggesting reasons for this discrepancy between the open-ended responses and the ratings. Maybe that is something that we could discuss after the talks. But for now, let us just sketch a few conclusions from the data that we've shown today. We have shown that when linguists are asked about what the general public should know about language, they typically come up with questions like, how and why do languages change? How do children acquire language? And how many languages are there in the world? And more generally, questions about language learning, language structure, and variation. Now, are these really the most important questions about language that the general public should know the answer to? Well, the results of the rating task suggest that even linguists themselves might not necessarily think so, because when we probed them, the question about language and power was rated as much more important than the one about how many languages there are in the world. Maybe this is because most respondents didn't have the time to really think about the issue at hand when they were filling out the survey, so they just wrote the first thing that came to their mind. But if that is the case, then it's still interesting that these are the things that come to mind first and not others. But also, we think that our results raise questions about who we should listen to when deciding what issues about language we should be focusing on in education or public outreach. And of course, also when deciding what questions to include in our survey that aims to find out what the general public knows or doesn't know about language. Is the majority of linguists the best source for this? Or maybe just those linguists that have devoted a lot of time to thinking about these kinds of issues? Or maybe linguists aren't the right people to ask about the value of language-related knowledge for the general public. Again, we are looking forward to your ideas and to a fruitful discussion. Finally, we want to use the opportunity to thank the funding buddies of our project and also to thank all the linguists that participated in our survey and to thank you for your attention. We look very much forward to your comments.